And I think the bigger part of the story is actually this part about whether you like it or not. It's a lot of the will of the state that is being imposed on the people as though it's the will of the people. And there's oftentimes the assumption that the will of the state is by definition benevolent. And therefore the people is in a position to gladly receive the gifts of the state. That may be true, but oftentimes that is not an accurate reflection of reality.
That voice was Yifei Li, Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at NYU Shanghai and Global Network Assistant Professor at NYU. He co-authored the book China Goes Green with a former professor of mine, Judith Shapiro. Earlier this year, through an alumni newsletter, I caught wind that Judith was publishing a book about the flavor of environmentalism and conservation that comes out of China's authoritarian governance. I was anticipating there was a story about restoration embedded in there too, because I often peruse the restoration news, and I have been increasingly seeing examples of restoration success coming out of the country. I jumped at the opportunity to reach out to Judith, one of my mentors during the time I spent at American University's Natural Resources and Sustainable Development program. In September, Polity Books published this thought-provoking book called China Goes Green, which Judith co-authored with Yifei. In the book, they unpack the geopolitics and the internal campaigns of coercive environmentalism to show how going green helps the state to further a complex agenda of cleaning up pollution, conserving wildlife, combating desertification, regulating the wildlife trade, pacifying the borderlands, resettling people, and expansion of power across the vast country and along the ever-expanding Belt and Road. This influence even creeps into the global commons and outer space. Yifei and Judith expertly explored both China's promises and successes as well as the risks and perverse side of China going green. Unlike liberal democracies, the country exemplifies a model of state-led environmentalism that focuses political, economic, and epistemic power under centralized leadership. Like any superpower, China has a gigantic hunger for natural resources and a growing desire to legitimize its environmental work to its populace and the world. The evocative question posed by the book is, what does it mean for the future of the planet when one of the world's most durable authoritarian governance systems pursues ecological civilization? I am going to explore this principal question and closely tangential issues with the authors on this episode. Yifei Li, again, is Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at NYU Shanghai. He received his master's and PhD degrees in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and bachelor's from Fudan University. In this academic year, he is also residential fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich. His research concerns both the macro-level implications of Chinese environmental governance for state-society relations, marginalized populations, and global ecological sustainability, as well as the micro-level bureaucratic processes of China's state interventions into the environmental realm. Judith Shapiro is Director of the Masters in Natural Resources and Sustainable Development for the School of International Services at American University, and Chair of the Global Environmental Politics Program. She was one of the first Americans to live in China after U.S.-China relations were normalized in 1979, and taught English at the Hunan Teachers College in Changsha, China. She also taught at Villanova, the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Aveiro, and the Southwest Agricultural University in Chongqing, China. She was visiting professor at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University. Professor Shapiro's research and teaching focuses on global environmental politics and policy, the environmental politics of Asia, and Chinese politics under Mao. She is the author, co-author, or editor of 9 books. Yifei and Judith will help us navigate China's landscape in a variety of ways. In this episode, I inquire about how they teamed up to write the book and their connection with China, the novel and not-so-novel Chinese approaches to address environmental problems, the evolving Belt and Road Initiative and its impacts on the environment, the role ethnicity plays in Chinese culture and in resettling people in the wake of development projects, what state-led environmentalism looks like and the role for non-state actors looking to participate, where the expansion of conservation areas is happening and what that means for people's livelihoods that live in the footprint of these protected areas, the one-size-fits-all pitfalls of combating desertification just by planting trees, how restoration could get co-opted into schemes like the reclamation of rare earth mines. I am Michael Yajic, the host of Treehugger Podcast, and this is a show about the science, practice, and humans of ecological restoration. Thanks for tuning into this episode on China Goes Green. One can find a link to the book and more in the show description of your podcast app, as well as on Treehugger Pod. Search for the page Joining Forces. Let's get after this story with Yifei Li and Judith Shapiro. See you on the other side. Hey, good morning.
Morning.
Hi, good evening, my side.
Good to see you all. I'm going to do some audio things here. All right. How's that? So good to see you all. I love this book. It was so really well written and understandable and accessible. And I understand it's not your first rodeo. You all are writers and researchers and academics. And I am interested to hear from you both what your connection to China is, and then how you decided to team up and where the inspiration for the book came from.
Well, I feel Yifei should go first since he's born, raised, and lived in China.
No, but you started your time in China way before I did. So.
Right.
Oh.
All right. Well, yeah. So I guess I'm the senior, literally, person in the team. And I've been living and working in China on and off since 1977. And my early work on China was more focused on the Mao period and human rights abuses during the Cultural Revolution. And then I became involved with the environment, and I wrote a book called China's Environmental Challenges. But the impetus for the book for me, particularly, there's two main impetuses, and I'll talk about one of them, and Yifei can talk about the other one. For me, in the last few years, I started to notice that the Chinese government was using ecological preservation or restoration even as a kind of excuse to take charge of certain ethnic minority areas in the western part of China. And they called that program ecological migration. And in fact, many states have tried to sedentarize or make settle down their nomads, and China is no different. But they've been trying to do this literally for centuries. And now it seems as if by using the environment as an excuse, they're getting some success. And so I always felt, when I first heard the term ecological migration, it sounded like something really nice. And I didn't understand until later that this was basically forcing nomads to give up their livelihoods, to give up their cultural identities, to make them go into cities, give them a couple bucks, and, nothing but problems for them after that. So that was my concern. And I met Yifei just at conference, and we met on panels or whatever. And then when I was teaching in China, Yifei teaches at NYU Shanghai, and I was for a while doing some guest teaching at the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua. And we said, when we're both in China, we'll get together. And I invited Yifei up to give a talk to my class. He invited me down to give a talk to his class. And then we began to say, well, wait a minute, we're both working on this issue. Maybe there's a book here. So that's how this started. And just before we turn it over to Yifei, I have to say that collaborating with Yifei, this is our first collaboration, it was just so easy. We worked so similarly to each other. And we always were working on Google Docs. And when I was awake, I would do stuff, and I would go to sleep, and he would wake up and he would do stuff. And, we complemented each other really beautifully, and it's just been a complete delight. So, yeah.
Yeah, and totally, I can't agree more on that note. I mean, I don't think we've had a single disagreement in writing this book.
No fights.
We just complemented each other in every imaginable way. And sometimes we would critique on each other's passages, not in the sense of disagreeing with each other, but in the sense of helping each other building these arguments even further. So I think this collaboration is something that I learned a lot from, and also just tremendously appreciated. But then on the note of working together on this book, one of the other impetuses for writing the book really is are observations about how in the English language literature in general, there's, on the one hand, a lot of frustration with how the democratic institutions have not been able to effectively deal with climate change in particular and environmental challenges in general. There seems to be a lot of roadblocks whenever a new environmental problem comes into our sight of vision. And then there are a lot of debates, a lot of deliberations, a lot of political issues with regard to bringing new legislations into existence. And on the other hand, to that frustration is a growing sense of admiration for what China has been able to do. People talk about the plastic bag ban in China, which was instituted almost overnight and was applied to the entire nation, a country of 1.4 billion almost overnight. And a lot of people talk about China's renewable energy promotion policies in terms of how China claims itself to be the largest user of solar energy. And in some cases, these numbers are true. But I think these examples of quote-unquote green successes are being amplified in a lot of Western media to a point that a lot of people are looking at China as a green leader, as a planetary leader for sustainability. We have doubts about that. And we wanted to more critically interrogate the question of whether China's authoritarian approach to environmental protection is a worthwhile model for all other countries on this planet to follow. And what are the promises? And perhaps more importantly, what are the risks in pursuing that approach? And in writing this book, part of our goal is really just honestly evaluate the achievements and the risks of the authoritarian approach to environmental protection and give China a fair reading, give them credit where credit is due, but also point out risks when there is verifiable evidence of the darker side.
Every day, we are reminded how liberal democracies failed to address environmental problems. What sort of solutions does the Chinese model offer? Is this a novel approach or an evolution or adaptation of governmental tools we have seen before in other capitalist states?
One thing we can admire is a certain decisiveness, right? Because in Western societies, sometimes people push back if it's inconvenient. I saw a really nice headline the other day that China is banning not only the bags, plastic bags, but also straws, and then those little shampoos that you get in hotels. No more hotel shampoos. And that's like a great thing, right? Who needs those little shampoos? You could have a pump bottle instead. And Think about all the plastic that's not going to be going into the ocean as a result of that. The problem that we identified, though, with some of these bans is there tends to be a big focus on quantitative targets. And the way the political structure is organized, officials are judged on their ability to meet these targets. So they're always looking upwards at their superiors to see whether their numbers are good or not. So you get some crazy distortions as a result of this. One example from the book is that there was an air pollution target last summer that everybody was supposed to meet. And in Henan province, whenever the threshing machines were turned on, that gave these really artificially huge spikes in the air pollution readings. And so the local officials, in fear, banned the use of threshing machines. And as a result, this whole region lost its grain. It just rotted. They weren't able to keep up with that. And so that's a kind of example of this target setting and sort of one size fits all and looking upwards to be evaluated by your superiors, that it's very, very damaging. Many innocent people get caught up in this.
Yeah, the other side to that story is, like Judy said, they're all looking up to their bureaucratic superiors. But the other side is that they're ignoring the people whom they govern. Right? They're not taking into consideration the livelihoods and the well-beings of the individual farmers whose lives were basically turned upside down by these draconian measures. So I think we document a policy model in which individual officials are being held accountable to their political superiors, but there is no incentive whatsoever for them to actually listen to the people, or for that matter, the scientists, the NGO volunteers, or whoever who don't actually play a role in evaluating these officials. And we think that turn out to be not the best model for governing the environment. If you want to actually improve environmental sustainability, you want to actually hear from these various voices in society so that you can understand how indeed each instances of environmental damage plays out to different groups, in different communities, in different locations across the country. And we have to remember China is a huge country that is geographically diverse and demographically very, very diverse. So we really can't count on these officials to know everything about such a diverse country.
Mm-hmm. And another dynamic that we identified, in addition to the target setting and the one-size-fits-all sort of problem, something we called green grabbing, as we started to move our attention to the less developed part of the country. And in that case, sometimes cloaked in environmental goals, local officials are able to carry out agendas that they've been hoping to carry out for other reasons. And one example is the building of these big dams, right? So oftentimes the big dams are being built far away from the people who would actually use the electricity, but rather the local officials are hoping to profit themselves from building these dams. And so what they do to justify the dams is talk about the renewable energy mix that the country as a whole needs to pursue by a certain date in order to comply with its commitments under the Paris Agreement, right? So unfortunately, hydropower, which is so plagued with human rights abuses and forcible resettlements, ends up being counted as renewable energy. And a lot of these dams are being built in the southwest part of the country, which is very mountainous, very prone to earthquakes, which makes these dams really vulnerable and dangerous. And also, it even affects downstream countries that are not China, particularly along the upper Mekong River, which has a tremendous impact on all of these countries in Southeast Asia, all the way down to Vietnam. So in the name, again, of environmental protection, these other agendas are being furthered. Very troubling.
Mm-hmm. We also document a similar pattern when Chinese state capital moves outside the country to the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. It's a very similar pattern in the sense that a lot of these projects on the Belt and Road are framed as ostensibly environmental projects. They're framed as green projects. But if we look at the actual extent of environmental impact, it's anything but green. But at the same time, like the domestic stories that Judy just described, many of these Belt and Road Initiative projects are also helping China, furthering a lot of its diplomatic and geopolitical interests. So in that sense, I think, one of the things we really try to highlight is how many of these environmental projects, whether it's in the industrial east of China or the relatively less developed areas of Western China, or even outside of China on the Belt and Road and even the global commons, there are a lot of these quote-unquote green justifications for doing a lot of the things that the Chinese state is invested in doing. But at the same time, these projects are helping China domestically and internationally to accomplish quite a few of non-environmental objectives. And these things are sometimes enveloped in a green discourse. But our goal is to actually take stock of these projects systematically to document these non-environmental aspects, which we think is being underappreciated in a lot of the discussions.
The listeners out there might be wondering what the Belt and Road Initiative is, because we do, well, at least in the U.S., we kind of live within this bubble and we don't necessarily know or think about the foreign policy of other countries if it's not directed at us, right? So the Belt and Road what I know is that it includes railway, high-speed railway to Europe that runs through several countries. And so there's some impression or some presence of Chinese policy or presence through those countries, and then through shipping to South China, as well as some sort of colonialism in Africa as well. If you all could expand on those sort of activities.
The Belt and Road is pretty much everything.
Yeah.
When they started out talking about it, it was supposed to be an overland revival of the old Silk Road of trading between Western China and essentially Turkey. And then there was a secondary road that went around South Asia and developed a series of deep water ports. Well, since then, and as you say, it's infrastructure. It's deep water ports, high-speed rail, fast highways, big dams, power plants, all of those sorts of mega infrastructure projects. Well, since those two initial, sea route and land routes have developed, essentially all these countries wanted to join the Belt and Road because by joining the Belt and Road Initiative, you start to get access to a certain type of very low-cost loan or Chinese investment in general. So there's a lot of excitement, and many, 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 many countries have joined the Belt and Road Initiative, including countries like Italy. So now the Belt and Road, there's a polar Belt and Road that goes across the Arctic, and there's a space Belt and Road that's all about satellites in the air, and the Belt and Road certainly includes Africa going down around that sea route, but also all of a sudden Latin America is part of the Belt and Road too. So pretty much anybody who says I'm part of the Belt and Road, they're part of the Belt and Road. That said, since those early days of maybe some excitement, some of these recipient countries have started to rethink whether this is some kind of a Trojan horse or something like that. And there's been some discussion of debt diplomacy. There were some famous examples where these loans went bad for developing countries, and countries lost sovereignty over really important infrastructure, such as the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, where Sri Lanka basically couldn't pay back their loans, and so they had to give essentially ownership to China. So this furthers what Yifei was saying about other kinds of geopolitical ambitions, because China and India, of course, don't get on well, and now China has a port that it controls right in India's backyard. They claim there's going to be no defense involved with it, but who knows, and so on and so forth. So a number of these countries have started to either try to renegotiate some of those loans or have second thoughts about some of the projects. So some of those countries include Malaysia, Myanmar. There are a bunch of countries in Africa that, like Sierra Leone, said, oh, you know what, I don't think I want this airport after all. And we'll have to see what the impact of the coronavirus is, because, of course, that coronavirus put a halt anyway to a lot of these projects, which are now slowly starting up again, but have generally given some of these countries a chance to rethink whether this is really a good deal for them or not. The other thing to look at with the Belt and Road is, where is that highway going? And so you might say, oh, wait a minute, that highway is going into that forest where then the timber is going to be extracted. Or, oh, that highway is going right into this mineral area. Or, you got to say, well, is this really about resource extraction and the broader problem that China is facing of sort of overcapacity, need to source new raw materials, sort of second stage capitalism, or the contradictions of this latter capitalism seem to be playing out on the Belt and Road.
I also want to add that if you look at many of these Belt and Road initiatives, I think, Michael, you're absolutely right to say that it's actually hard to know what the Belt and Road actually is, right? Just like Judy said, it keeps changing its own meanings. And initially, the Chinese name of the project has never changed, but its English translation, when it first came out, its official translation was One Belt, One Road, in referencing to what Judy described. Initially it was the land-based Silk Road, and then the ocean route. So initially it was meant to be like that, but it really doesn't make sense once you expand beyond these two routes. Once China began to explore multiple alternative routes, it just doesn't makes sense to call that One Belt and One Road. So they changed the translation to the BRI, which stands for the Belt and Road Initiative. One of the things I think we tried to pay very close attention to in our chapter about the BRI is how many of these initiatives were framed as green. For example, China's export of its own digital technologies, the 5G communications technologies and many of the other surveillance technologies are framed as green development, quite simply because of their argument that if these governments on the Eurasia continent all use Chinese-provided technologies to conduct government businesses, then you will save a lot of paper because the paperwork will now be all filed electronically. Well, great. It is indeed savings in paper use, and perhaps you can save a forest. But once again, following our earlier patterns of describing these stories, we want to not only understand the bright sides of these stories, but also what are the less talked about aspects of these stories. We then looked at the strategic interests in exporting Chinese technology, the strategic interests in using Chinese satellites to gain access to all of these countries along the Eurasia continent and even beyond, to use Chinese government-owned satellites to provide data for these countries, while at the same time making sure that Chinese state agencies continue to own all of these remote sensing data for countries from Uzbekistan to Italy. And I think, that is an aspect that is underappreciated, but it's just so important for the future of the planet if we are presuming that China's model of quote-unquote green development on the Belt and Road is the answer for global sustainability. Then we have to be very careful about documenting every aspect of its implications.
And one more thing I want to add about the Belt and Road is that China's understanding of sustainability on the Belt and Road is very carbon focused, right? So even though in fact they're exporting coal-fired power plants, they claim to be fairly carbon neutral along the Belt and Road. But what they don't seem to pay any attention to at all, and you'll appreciate this, and your listeners will appreciate this from a biodiversity point of view, is they don't seem to understand that highways and railways carve up ecosystems, and it's not even just what happens along that particular route, but it ends up being all these capillaries. Once you start to make it possible for human economic activity to enter into these areas, then it spreads out, and so habitat gets carved up. And we have, island biogeography at work with its high extinction rates. So whether it's the dams, the highways, the railways, they all have tremendous impact on global biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. Definitely the land routes I can see just leads to more fragmentation, particularly in the borderlands that are, I would say, predominantly natural. And just to give us a sense of kind of where these borderlands are, and it seems like that's where a lot of the dam creation is going. And we are very familiar with dams in my part of the world in the Pacific Northwest. And the Columbia River is just like a massive watershed that includes essentially like most of my state, all of Idaho, most of Oregon. There's just dozens and dozens of dams. It's like heavily regulated nature along this area. And particularly with climate change, changing the level of snow that we receive and the temperatures, and the importance of salmon as a resource, as a food resource, and very important culturally, it's just had like really devastating effects. So from the dam perspective, and I think back in the day when I think in the U.S. we first started hearing about dam construction in China, it was like the Three Gorges Dam. The intention is to not only create hydroelectric power, but it meters out the water over time, and lots of resettlement occurs, just like thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people get resettled, right? And those people, where do you think they end up? And I guess this question too, for those people that do get resettled, what role, I guess, does like racism play? Is there some sort of form of racism that's analogous to the sort of racism that I'm, I guess, most familiar with in the United States?
The Chinese like to tell the story that they're one big happy family. and they've labeled something like 55 different ethnic minority groups that supposedly have various kinds of preferential treatment, like they can have more than one child. Even back in the olden days when the one-child family policy was being very strongly implemented, they were allowed to have an extra child, but this is a very controlled sort of categorization, and a lot of the same dynamics that we see in the US with exoticism or sexualization, this whole notion that somehow ethnic minorities love to dance and they're wild and crazy. There's an assumption that Han, which is the dominant Chinese group, that Han Chinese civilization is superior, and that these ethnic minorities should feel lucky to be the beneficiaries of the largesse of Beijing. And of course, the reality on the ground, whether you're talking about great big territories like Tibet, Greater Tibet was way bigger even than the so-called Tibetan Autonomous Region, or Xinjiang, where we're hearing so much about the essentially cultural and sometimes even literal genocide of whole huge swaths of the Muslim population. Those are two really egregious examples, but there are so many other different groups, whether they're sort of Thai groups and different kinds of upland groups that are the same groups that you might find in Thailand or Burma. So is there racism involved? Yeah, there's this assumption, and it's a genuine kind of puzzlement sometimes on the part of Han Chinese, like, why aren't these people more grateful? Why don't they like us? We're bringing them development, but it's of course development as defined by Beijing. It's not development as defined by the local people.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we see again and again in these cases of infrastructure-related relocation is that the government spends public money to relocate these affected residents into newly built residential neighborhoods. The assumption being that if you previously lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, we're now moving you into a 3-bedroom apartment. How nice is that, right? The government is paying for the builders to upgrade your living conditions. And that has been a very common framing for a lot of these forcible relocations, whether it's in dam-related projects in Western China or even in the most developed parts of China where I live in Shanghai. If they want to demolish an older neighborhood, the assumption is always that, okay, you guys are affected by a government mandate for urban regeneration. Our compensation for you is to move you into a nicer neighborhood, a larger apartment, whether you like it or not. And I think the bigger part of the story is actually this part about whether you like it or not. It's a lot of the will of the state that is being imposed on the people as though it's the will of the people. And there's oftentimes the assumption that the will of the state is by definition benevolent, and therefore the people is in a position to gladly receive the gifts of the state. That may be true, but oftentimes that is not an accurate reflection of reality. But Michael, to address your question about racism, I'm not sure there is a comparable extent of racism like what the United States experienced in many of its own histories. But I think in China, oftentimes the racial story or the ethnic story, like Judy said, the Han ethnic majority looking down upon ethnic minorities is an implicit storyline that's underneath a lot of these development initiatives. But also at the country, in the country more generally, there seems to be a general sense of discrimination or a willful self-deception to not see discrimination on the basis of socioeconomic class, right? If these are villages who don't have a lot of money, who don't have political power, who don't have political connections even, then it's okay to tell them where to go and to make them go where the government wants them to go. Whereas if the affected community is relatively better off, is just a generally well-to-do urban neighborhood, let's say in the center of Shanghai, then no, they don't get the same treatment. They get to say where they want to go and how they want to go.
Yeah, and I see this playing out in the theme of how China is expanding its national parks and nature preserves. There was just like recently an article in like National Geographic that celebrated this because we're saving pandas and snow leopards, and that's just looks good from the outside. I think the article, to its credit, did explain some of the intricacies and some of the darker side of it. So I'm curious what this looks like on the ground, because these are massive parks. Is this going to be just some reiteration of the sort of fortress style protected areas that the U.S. has sort of exported, and what it means for livelihoods of people who are living in these areas now? How might positive reports about habitat preservation and restoration be a vehicle for the state to basically consolidate and centralize power in some of these borderland areas?
Well, if you look at the history of national parks in China, the very first national park, which is known as the Pudacuo National Park in the southwest, it is very much a fortress-style park. Judy and I have visited the park on separate occasions, but that park itself has a designated route. You can't drive in that park at all. You have to take one of their shuttle buses. There are, I can't remember exactly, 3 or 4 stops where you can get off the bus. And you can get off the bus, and there's a photo op. And you can take a picture and then get back on the bus. It's a very, I want to say, a very staged show of the national park. There were some trails, as I understand, but when I was there, at least, all of the trails were closed off to visitors. You can only take a bus to go through that government-designated route. But in our book, I think one of the things we're really interested in documenting is the effect of these new national parks on the livelihoods of the local people. We're seeing communities, entire villages, being told that they have to move. But on top of it, their means of income, now by virtue of these new parks being built, will now have to change into service provision. They can offer horse rides to visitors. They can offer a hotel stay, or they can do some form of a bed and breakfast operation if they have the means. But in a sense, the livelihood choices of these villages come to be narrowly defined by what modern tourism looks like. Now, we're seeing in this new national park plan of China, there seems to be a lot more sensitivity than that first example to people's livelihoods, to an understanding that, at least a recognition that the fortress style may not be the best way to go when it comes to biodiversity conservation and human nature cohabitation. So there are some conscious designs to make sure that there are buffer zones outside of the park proper, and inside these buffer zones, different kinds of human activities will continue to be allowed. That, I think, is a welcoming sign. At least it's moving in the right direction. But once again, we're talking about parks that are much, much bigger than Pudacuo. The first national park is just extremely small. It was meant as a pilot case, so its size reflects that intention. But now that China is moving so aggressively to a national network of humongous national parks, I think it takes a lot more than just recognition of some of the problems, but it takes a lot of real work to acknowledge both the biological diversity inside of all of these parks, as well as the different choices of life that people have made for generations who depend on these lands.
It does create enormous insecurity among these people. So they don't know themselves whether the state will continue to allow them to stay or whether they may be told they have to leave tomorrow with no advance notice. So, we're really talking about enormous swaths of land. And as Yifei says, maybe the state would have liked to have emptied out that land of people, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And that's, not more than the state can handle. The other question about these parks is to ask the question, who is profiting from them? And oftentimes, what we found with Pudacuo, again, going on separate occasions, that gate fee that you pay goes not to local people. It goes how upwards, it disappears. And the local people, if the only jobs that are available are maybe there's somebody on the bus who's like the explainer, but that somebody on the bus who's the explainer has to be able to speak good standard Chinese. And a lot of these local people don't speak good standard Chinese. And the hotels that were at the gate area were often investment from wealthy, sophisticated people from Eastern China, and they weren't being run by the local people who didn't have that kind of hospitality training. So there's some real concerns, I think, in the building of these parks.
The one other thing, and I can't help but ask you since I have you here, is transitions from coal-fired or carbon-intensive energy sources to solar energy, and then also us driving electric vehicles, use of our cell phones. The other issue that's come up in the last decade at least, but really is kind of, I think we're going to start to hear more about it at some point in time, is mining rare earth minerals. As mines become obsolete at some point in time in the future, that there is some restoration involved in reclaiming those degraded areas or repairing those areas. So, but rare earth minerals, I think, was another dynamic between the U.S. and China that played out fairly recently, and that basically there was somewhat of an embargo. And so our electric vehicles, which are essentially like computers on wheels, right? They require so many of these rare earth minerals that really aren't rare, but in refining them, there's some byproducts that are pretty harmful. And I think China at some point in time was offering like 97% of the rare earth minerals to the rest of the world. And now I think we're starting to see development of these rare earth mines. I think there's one in California and perhaps maybe one in Africa or whatnot. So, but for a while, like China sort of had the monopoly on rare earths.
You're absolutely right. I mean, and China was using that effective monopoly position as sort of a leverage in the U.S.-China trade war, but also when China and Japan, the diplomatic relations between the two countries didn't go so well, China effectively used its monopoly to force Japan into a position where it had to accept some of the Chinese terms of negotiations. So that definitely was an issue. But on the note of rare earth use itself, I think you were absolutely right that these materials were extremely harmful to extract. The chemical byproducts, have long-lasting harmful effects on the soil, water, and air for entire communities. And in fact, there is a rare earth mines tailings dam in northern China, which a few of my students visited, and we're actually in the process of writing a paper about it. It was just complete damage. It was apocalyptic damage of an entire area. And the cab drivers even refused to take my students to that tailings dam because everybody in the city knew that that's a no-go zone. That's how bad it is. But now, as you were describing, because that these other countries, Australia, the United States, and Canada, and Japan, are trying to challenge China's monopoly of rare earth provision, these countries are all trying to reinvigorate their own mines, like you pointed out in California. But what about the environmental costs of doing that? Right? And we also have to think about why we need all of these rare earth elements. Because we're changing our phones too frequently, because we're using too many gadgets. And all of these gadgets require some form of rare earth elements. So if we don't tackle that consumption problem and keep demanding more and more rare earth elements from the planet, there's simply not enough capacity for the planet to supply all of our needs for all of these elements.
We've talked about some of the downsides, but some of the successes that China's had with restoring air, land, and waters. And then there is a civil society, as I understand, in China. And what are those organizations? Because I think sometimes it's hard to know who they are and what role they play in either promoting good governance, and how, too, what you've illuminated in the book is how sometimes they're kind of co-opted by the state in some ways.
I think we documented a number of examples in which people from outside of the state participated in some of the policy-making processes that ended up improving these policies in very, very significant ways. We're talking about environmental filmmakers who spent years documenting trash in the vicinity of Beijing, or documenting the flows of plastic waste imports into China and where they end up. We talked about environmental journalists who investigated into the negative environmental and human consequences of dams. And their reports ended up being read by top state officials, and it was used, in fact, as evidence to stop some of the dam construction projects. We also documented scientists who actually spoke up about some of the negative environmental consequences for projects, and their voices, when heard by the state, were incorporated into the policy framework to better Chinese environmental policy making. We both work with environmental NGOs. We know a lot of people who founded and who play significant roles in various environmental NGOs across China, and they do an admirable amount of work all over the country to clean up the beaches, to teach people how to recycle, to teach various school kids how to reuse their various gadgets for purposes that they may not previously be aware of. So a lot of work that aren't necessarily framed as independent of the state just because of the political situation in China, but are framed as efforts to help the state, efforts to improve the state's understanding of a problem, perhaps, to help create better environmental impact assessments, or just bring issues that the state isn't aware of, state officials themselves aren't aware of, into their field of vision so that they can better appreciate the consequences and implications of the work that they do. It simply would not be accurate to say that there's not a civil society in China. There is a robust civil society, but I think their work is sometimes sidelined, sometimes marginalized, but we still have to recognize that they do a tremendous amount of great work. And the state would fare so much better if it actually pays attention to all of these good inputs from its own people.
The way civil society groups operate in China is very different from outside of China, whereas in the US, for example, civil society groups are often framed as in opposition in some way to the state. In China, in order to operate and be effective, you have to have allies within the state. And often China's, say, Communist Party is not monolithic. It's very complex, and there's liberal parts and conservative parts and pro-growth and business parts and more pro-conservation parts and so on and so forth. So essentially, the civil society groups will ally with friends within the Ministry of Environmental Protection, and for the shared goal of trying to clean up the air, clean up the water, make the food safe, all of these things, which is very much in the interest of the Communist Party of China. And so as China becomes a wealthy country, there's much less patience for this level of toxicity in the environment. So the Communist Party knows they've got to clean up this environment, or people are just going to be saying, you know what, maybe we're not going to support you anymore. So that's kind of the deal, right? The Communist Party knows they've got to deal with the environment. They've got to deal with corruption. They've got to deal with the extreme inequality that the country is facing right now. And so it's a legitimacy question for them. So that's sort of the background of why all of a sudden Xi Jinping is talking about ecological civilization and saying that the green hills and clear waters are actually mountains of silver and rivers of gold, something like that. I mean, this is good stuff, to have a clean environment is part of their vision of the greatness of China.
If I could add to that a little bit, I think the Chinese state wants a better environment badly for precisely the legitimacy reasons that Judy pointed out. But at the same time, the state seems to have not fully realized the fact that in order to get there, the state cannot act on its own. In order to effectively manage its own environment, it's just inevitable and imperative that the state has to consult with all of these groups within the Chinese society. Because without these inputs, the state simply doesn't know what the unintended consequences might be and what the less visible population groups might be responding. So it knows it wants, but it doesn't seem to know very well how it can get there. And what we're arguing, especially towards the end of the book, is that China has a political system that by design, from 1949, when Mao created the political system, he instituted this thing that's called political consultations to precisely avoid a situation where the Communist Party became so complacent about its own dealings to a point that ignores these various other voices in society. So Mao emphasized from the get-go that there needs to be political consultations by the party to various social groups within society. So our argument is not for China to create any new institutions, and certainly not for China to adopt a Western institution, but rather for China to go back to its own roots that were created in 1949 and revive that aspect of the political institution that seems to have been marginalized over time.
If people were from the outside looking in at China, look for reliable information coming out, like of what actually going on. I think I sent you some resources where I saw a few presentations. Sometimes I read things. I see some news and it looks like incredible. And for my first instinct sometimes is that it seems like propaganda, and it doesn't really get into like the nitty gritty or the nuances of the story. Where can some people look to for what I would say is reliable news or sort of that nuanced opinion about the kind of environmental work that's going on in China?
Well, one place I always go is China Dialogue. So that's a London and Beijing-based web platform, ChinaDialogue.net. And you can get information in both English and Chinese there. I also like Greenpeace East Asia. Greenpeace China has very good information. They have a Beijing office. If they need to, they'll pull back to Hong Kong. I also, frankly, I like The Guardian and the New York Times and all of those mainstream Western publications.
One of the sources that I watch closely is the South China Morning Post. It's based out of Hong Kong. They do tremendous work. They provide, I would say, the most comprehensive coverage of China just because of their proximity to the country. It's in English. It's readily accessible. All of their stories are online for free. It's just a great source. And, also to your listeners, if they're interested in finding out more about reliable sources on China and particularly China's environment, I think our bibliography would be a great place to check out. We actually did comprehensive research in many of the cases that we describe in the book. And we were trying to be very, very meticulous in acknowledging the sources that informed us, that provided a lot of the firsthand information that we drew from. So please check out that bibliography. There's a lot of good stuff in it.
It was incredible. Now that you mention it too. So I don't know if you see my copy. I've had like these, you can't really see all my highlights and whatnot. I'm a geek. Trees are my thing and reforestation. So I read like once you started like discussing the afforestation, there were some citations. I was like, wow, it was really incredible. The nuances you went into about these reforestation or afforestation projects and how there's sort of a double-edged sword where like tree planting is just overemphasized in so many places, or it's a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, and sometimes it can have detrimental effects, especially when you're trying to build forests in traditionally like an ecosystem that wasn't forest to begin with, and how it can have effects on the water quantity and quality, as well as actually work against the carbon capture that you're trying to go for. I would agree. Your bibliography is pretty incredible. And even to the references, if it's not a reading material, I found some of the documentaries. I was able to chase down some of the documentaries. In particular, I think it's a pretty well-known one, that Plastic China documentary. I think it was heartbreaking to see the layers of the small operations that exist or did exist in some sort of the plastic recycling business, and how that was celebrated as a big win for China, that they started repelling all our plastic in a very short order too. It seemed like overnight to us, but you actually document that it actually took quite a bit of time, and it was reinforced through these multilateral conventions and through the World Trade Organization, where actually China fought back. And now the rest of the world is sort of scrambling on where to send plastics. But plastic is so pervasive in our society that it really doesn't go away. And it's so important to us. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of it. It's in my fillings, in my cavities, my microphone stand, it's the computer. There's so many important things that plastics play, but it does have downstream detrimental effects on people's health and well-being.
Yeah, I was the China's waste bans, whether plastic or e-waste or the others, I think they're fantastic, right? Because they really are forcing developed countries to come to terms with our own consumption in a different sort of way. And ultimately, if developed countries get choked in their own garbage, that may allow consumers to put more pressure on manufacturers to start to manufacture things with fewer alloys that are hard to recycle, with more reusable products, with less packaging. I think that's a very, very positive development. But at the same time, whenever you make a major shift like that, there are people who are generally from the most vulnerable parts of society who used to make their living off of this industry. And those people end up all of a sudden being out of work. So that's something to be aware of too.
Michael, I also want to go back to your earlier comment about trees, because I think your listeners would appreciate more discussion about trees. You were absolutely right that in our book, we talked about the Chinese efforts to plant more trees, but it was all monocultural forests, as we discussed in the book. But I wanted to point out that it would be inaccurate to think that this phenomenon is uniquely Chinese, because it's not. Donald Trump is saying that he wants to commit U.S. federal money to the so-called Billion Tree Initiative, which at its core is the exact same thing that the Chinese Communist Party has been doing. And once again, it's not just China and the U.S. We're seeing various other countries, newly elected presidents trying to impress their citizens by saying that they're committing huge public resources into creating monocultural forests. That is not good news for the planet. That is terrible from a planetary ecosystem point of view. It takes genuine knowledge, care, and thoughtful designs of policies to actually have effective environmental policies.
Exactly. I'm glad you brought that up. As you might know, the United Nations has claimed or named the next decade is one of their decades of emphasis, and it's going to be the decade on ecosystem restoration. The Society for Ecological Restoration and many other folks from civil society really emphasize the importance of planting monocultures is not restoration. There's kind of a line sometimes where we draw a line in the sand and we're like, this is restoration, and then this is not restoration. So yeah, it's important to talk about or emphasize. And I don't want to end it like totally rosy, but I do want to get to know you all a little bit. And there's the one question I do ask everyone is what their favorite trees are, because I think it's always nice to hear what the stories that people have associated with nature, particularly trees.
I can answer that. I love that question. And the first tree species that comes to my mind is actually poplar trees. This may actually be complete.
Wow.
You were?
Well, I was going to say tulip poplar, not your kind of poplar, but tulip
poplar. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I like poplar trees because they strike me as a symbol for uprightness, for being upright, if you see what I mean. They have this shape that is, they don't strike me as intimidating at all, but they seem to have a spirit that always looks up. I don't know. This may be completely weird to say because in the book we keep saying that, they're planting too many poplar trees. And these poplar trees are indeed sucking up so much underground water to a point that they're causing significant irreversible ecological damage. But still, I mean, these individual trees strike me as completely beautiful creatures.
So I was going to say I like the tulip poplar, which I guess is also known as the tulip tree.
Tulip tree.
And they grow in the eastern part of the United States, and I've learned that they are native species, and they're so tall and so straight. And I learned that the reason they're called tulip trees is the leaves have the tulip shape, and then the flower has a tulip shape, and then that seed pod also has a tulip shape. And I always feel I don't know much about trees, but sometimes I take my students on a walk in the woods, and I'm so proud that I say, do you know what kind of tree this is? And I can teach them that, how to recognize it from the shape of the leaf. Yeah, those are beautiful trees. They're very, very, very tall. They're very, very old. And there's a lot of them in the eastern part of the United States.
Nice. Yeah, I love those as well. I love, the poplars too. Maybe not the first poplar I think people have mentioned on the show. I think one of the former guests, talked about a different variety of poplar. I'm tracking this, by the way. So you'll see I think I just got an idea on the website. I'm going to display them because they all have, the stories are so incredible. And most of the time it makes people smile. And especially after talking about these really deep topics, I just want to leave you with a little bit of positivity. After the podcast ends, usually reflecting back, I associate you all now with those trees too. Thank you. It's a good gift you left me anyway. I don't know if you have any feelings about kind of where we're at presently with China, and you see any trends that we should keep in our minds or be scanning for in the news that we read.
I don't know. I guess I want to say be wary of things about China that seem overly rosy and things about China that seem overly dark. Oftentimes, the tendency, especially in some English language outlets, to project China as a monolith. Sometimes it's projected as, the country with these complex, deep cultural roots that can teach the West about how to live, about the art of war, about calligraphy, about all these sophisticated things. But at other times, there's the tendency to project China as this rising power that people should be scared of, right? This rising dragon that you don't seem to understand at all. Well, neither strikes me as accurate, simply because China is complicated. China has many peoples. China has many different socioeconomic classes, just like the United States, just like Germany, just like every other country on the planet. And we have to recognize that whatever the Chinese government does, there are many other social groups. There are different scientists. There are different college students that are doing things that may or may not align very well with what the Chinese government wants. It's just a complex country, and we should resist the tendency to reduce that to a one-dimensional description of goodness or badness. That's all I want to say.
Love it. That's great. Well, it was good to see you all. Good to meet you, Yifei. Thanks for staying up late.
Judy knows I usually stay up until, fairly late, about 1 or 2 a.m. But I had a long day, and I'm fresh out of quarantine. I'm still adjusting to life in society, having been away from social life for so long. Today was actually my first day back on campus. I see some of my colleagues, and I go why aren't you behind a Zoom screen? I'm scared to be.
Oh, 3D. It's like real life again. It's nice.
Yeah, but thank you, Michael.
Of course. Yeah, Judith, good to see you as always.
It's been fun.
I hope you all enjoyed that peek under the hood of China's environmental agenda. It provides some great context and perspective on news we might see about conservation and restoration coming out of the country. We should pay attention. For example, in his speech to the UN General Assembly on September 22, 2020, President Xi Jinping announced that China will pledge to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and reach carbon neutrality before 2060. How will they accomplish this ambitious goal? Decreasing emissions is one thing, but this could also allow for the potential of more afforestation that we talked about in the interview, wetland restoration, and nature-based projects that increase carbon sinks. After this discussion with Dr. Shapiro and Lee, the big question is not only how these projects are implemented with ecosystem thinking in mind, but also how these projects intersect with and impact people's livelihoods, environmental health, and ethnic tensions in the country. A few other things before we boogie out on this episode. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration revealed its strategy after a lengthy review process over spring and summer. There has been a launch of a new decadeonrestoration.org. The Decade team is crowdsourcing the hype for the net benefit of all cultures and ecosystems that are critical in combating climate change, lifting up livelihoods, and saving 1 million species from extinction. How would you like to be part of that movement is the biggest question. And I'll be following this story for a while, so stay tuned. Before we close out too, I want to let you know that Sean Rowe from Resonant Restoration started an ecological restoration network for podcasts. So if you know any more restoration podcasters out there, let us know. We sat down recently to record a conversation, and one can find that episode now. It's called Symbiotic in Seattle because I think Tom Hanks leaves an impression on Sean. Anyway, Sean and I chat about urban forests, science communication, Pacific Madrones, plate tectonics, things like that. So thanks for supporting Treehugger Friends, and one can find all of them on treehuggerpod.com on the page named Joining Forces. Then join me next time on Treehugger Podcast as I discuss how to level up our rights to a healthy environment and stable climate with Maya Kayvon Rossum. Maya is a lawyer by training and the Delaware Riverkeeper. She and her team have been building alliances across the country in order to get rid of fracking infrastructure, ensure clean water and air. The long-term campaign is to install green amendments into each and every state constitution in the United States. Here's a sample from our discussion.
As a result of my work as the Delaware Riverkeeper, there's this new national movement that I founded, and it's called the Green Amendment Movement. And there's another organization I founded called Green Amendments for the Generations, which is about this idea of advancing green amendments. And you are right. Over the entirety of people's lives, they haven't learned about the right to pure water and clean air, a stable climate, and healthy environment, certainly not in the way they've heard about the rights to free speech and freedom of religion, private property rights, even gun rights. And that's because here in the United States of America, as much as people like to believe in their hearts and their minds that they have a right to clean water and clean air, they don't. They don't because it's not enumerated and protected in the Bill of Rights section of our state and federal constitutions. And that's what a Green Amendment is. A Green Amendment is putting into the Bill of Rights section of our constitutions nationwide the rights to pure water and clean air, a stable climate, and healthy environments.
Thanks for joining me again. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for information about my guests, Judith Shapiro and Yifei Lee. Find us online at treehuggerpod.com and social media at treehuggerpod. Subscribe, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you're listening to. Music for the show was provided by the Seattle band Dumb Thumbs. You can find all of their tunes at dumbthumbs.bandcamp.com. Thanks for hanging out. See you next time.